In late 2025, a screenshot began spreading across social media that made millions of people stop scrolling. It showed a conversation with Grok, the artificial intelligence built by Elon Musk's company xAI, appearing to describe a 2,000-year-old Egyptian carving in the language of an electrical engineer. Within days, the screenshot had been reposted, translated, and argued over on nearly every platform online. Some people called it proof that ancient Egypt had secretly harnessed electricity thousands of years before Thomas Edison. Others called it nothing more than a chatbot echoing decades of internet folklore back at the people asking it questions. But almost no one paused to ask the most important question of all. What exactly was Grok looking at, and where did this mystery actually begin? To understand why a single AI response could ignite this much panic and fascination at once, we have to go back far earlier than 2025, back to a temple wall in Upper Egypt that has been quietly provoking arguments for more than 60 years. Before we go there, make sure you are subscribed, because this story only gets stranger from here. The carving at the center of this storm sits inside the Temple of Hathor at Dendera, one of the most completely preserved religious complexes to survive from ancient Egypt. The temple standing today was built starting around 54 BCE, during the final decades of the Ptolemaic dynasty, under a ruler named Ptolemy XII, and construction and decoration continued on into the era of Roman control over Egypt. That makes the visible structure remarkably late in Egyptian history, built roughly 2,000 years after the pyramids of Giza had already stood for over 2 millennia. But the site itself is far older than the stone we see today. Inscriptions inside the temple claim that a sacred building had stood on this exact ground since the earliest dynasties of Egyptian civilization, meaning the symbols and religious traditions carved into these walls were not invented by the Ptolemaic architects. They were most likely inherited, copied, and reinterpreted from an oral and artistic tradition stretching back thousands of years before the temple's final form was ever built. That single fact already complicates the mystery, because it means the strange image we are about to describe may encode ideas far older than the stone that carries it. Dendera is dedicated to the goddess Hathor, worshipped in ancient Egypt as a deity of love, joy, music, and motherhood, and pilgrims once traveled enormous distances along the Nile just to stand inside her sanctuary. The temple complex itself is massive, spanning tens of thousands of square meters, filled with towering columns, open courtyards, and painted ceilings depicting the night sky in extraordinary detail, including the famous zodiac ceiling that once decorated one of its rooftop chapels, before being removed to a museum in Paris in the 19th century. Visitors walking through the main hypostyle hall today can still see faces deliberately chiseled off many of the goddess figures, damage generally attributed to religious iconoclasm carried out centuries after the temple's original construction. But hidden beneath the public halls, cut into the bedrock itself, are a series of small crypts that ordinary worshippers were never permitted to enter. These underground chambers were reserved for a select group of priests who had undergone specific ritual initiation. And it was here, deep beneath the temple, away from sunlight, away from the crowds, that the strangest carvings in all of Dendera were placed. The contrast matters. Every carving on the temple's public walls was designed to be seen, understood, and venerated by ordinary people passing through, while everything tucked into these crypts was deliberately hidden from view, reserved for a narrow circle who already possessed the religious training to interpret it correctly. That distinction alone is part of why this particular image has attracted so much suspicion over the decades. Secrecy tends to invite speculation, whether or not the thing being hidden actually deserves it. The image itself is carved in low relief across several crypt walls. It shows a long, rounded, oval-shaped object, resembling nothing so much as an enormous, elongated glass bulb. Inside that oval shape, a snake, its body curving in a smooth, undulating line, appears to float in open space, exactly where a modern viewer's eye would expect to see a glowing filament. Beneath the bulb shape stands a thick pillar, and at the base of the whole scene, a kneeling or standing figure appears to support the entire structure on outstretched arms, almost like a technician bracing a piece of equipment. To a modern eye trained on decades of consumer electronics, the visual resemblance to an old-fashioned incandescent light bulb or to a vacuum tube is immediate and unmistakable. This resemblance is not something that only internet theorists invented recently. It has troubled trained engineers for well over half a century. Mainstream Egyptology has a name and a well-documented explanation for the scene. The elongated oval container is understood to depict a vessel known in Egyptian religious texts as an HNNWT, and the figure inside it is identified as the god Harsomtus, shown in serpent form, emerging from a lotus blossom. In Egyptian creation mythology, the lotus flower represents the moment the world itself came into being, the point where the sun first rose out of the primeval waters of chaos. The snake, in this context, is not a symbol of danger, but of divine energy, renewal, and the life force flowing through creation. The pillar beneath the oval shape is identified as a Jed pillar, an ancient symbol of stability and endurance that appears throughout Egyptian art for thousands of years, long before Dendera was ever built, and it has no established connection to electrical insulation in any other context across Egyptian civilization. According to this reading, the entire scene is a religious tableau describing the birth of a solar deity from cosmic waters, wrapped inside the protective womb of the sky goddess Nut, not a technical diagram of any kind. There are, in fact, at least 5 or 6 nearly identical versions of this scene carved throughout the crypts of Dendera, each showing small variations in the snake's position, but sharing the same essential structure, which fits comfortably with a repeated religious motif meant to be understood by initiated priests, the same way a repeated icon or symbol might appear throughout any religious building. So if the explanation already exists, and has existed for a very long time, why does this carving keep resurfacing as a mystery, generation after generation? The answer traces back to a single moment in 1966, when an Austrian electrical engineer named Walter Garn came across photographs of the Dendera crypt reliefs. Garn was not a historian, and he had no particular investment in ancient Egyptian religion. He was looking at the image purely through the eyes of his own profession, and what he saw troubled him. To Garn, the oval container looked less like a symbolic vessel and more like a large glass envelope. The snake inside reminded him specifically of a Crookes tube, an early type of vacuum tube developed in the 1870s that produces a visible glow when high voltage passes through a low-pressure gas, the same basic technology that, decades later, would lead to the discovery of X-rays and would eventually power old cathode ray tube televisions. The pillar beneath it, in his eyes, resembled an electrical insulator, a component whose entire purpose is to keep 2 charged elements safely separated from one another. Garn published his interpretation, and almost overnight, a purely religious carving became, for a certain audience, potential evidence of forgotten ancient technology. Garn's idea did not stay confined to engineering circles for long. In 1968, the Swiss author Erich von Däniken published a book called Chariots of the Gods, arguing that ancient civilizations across the world had received advanced knowledge from extraterrestrial visitors, and the Dendera carving became one of his central pieces of supporting imagery. Von Däniken expanded on the idea further in his 1989 book, The Eyes of the Sphinx, describing the elongated shapes explicitly as light bulbs powered by some unexplained ancient energy source, the DJed pillars as insulators, and the lotus stems as cables running toward hidden underground power stations beneath the temple. From that point forward, the Dendera light, as it came to be called, was permanently woven into the broader ancient-astronaut theory, appearing in documentaries, books, and eventually thousands of internet articles and videos, each one adding its own layer of speculation on top of the last. Egyptologists pushed back almost immediately, and their objections were substantial. The proposed power cables, they pointed out, are structurally identical to lotus stems found in completely unrelated Egyptian carvings that have nothing to do with the crypt scene at all, appearing in ordinary decorative borders throughout Dendera and other temples where no one has ever suggested an electrical reading. The supposed insulator, the DJed pillar, appears in Egyptian art as far back as the Old Kingdom, more than 2,000 years before Dendera was built, always in a purely religious context tied to the myth of the god Osiris and the concept of stability enduring through death and resurrection. If the DJed pillar was secretly an electrical component all along, it would mean an entire multi-thousand-year religious tradition had been hiding technical blueprints in plain sight across dozens of unrelated temples without a single wire, socket, or power source ever being physically found to go along with any of them. That is an enormous claim to rest on a visual resemblance alone, and it is precisely the kind of gap that mainstream historians say the theory has never managed to close. One detail kept the theory alive more than almost any other, and it is a genuinely difficult question even for mainstream historians to fully resolve. How were the artists who carved these deep, complex, perfectly proportioned reliefs able to see what they were doing in rooms that received no natural sunlight whatsoever? The standard explanation offered by Egyptologists is that workers used polished bronze or copper mirrors to redirect sunlight down through corridors and around corners, sometimes using a relay of several mirrors in sequence, supplemented by simple oil lamps for close, detailed work. This technique is well documented in other ancient Egyptian tombs and chambers, and modern experiments recreating the mirror relay method have shown it can, in fact, deliver usable working light even several turns and many meters away from the nearest entrance. Proponents of the light bulb theory have long pointed to the apparent absence of soot staining on some crypt ceilings as evidence that oil lamps could not have been the primary light source, arguing that burning lamps for the hours needed to complete such detailed carving work should have left obvious blackened residue overhead. This claim sounds compelling on its surface, but it runs into a serious problem because soot deposits have in fact been documented in numerous Egyptian tombs and underground chambers elsewhere, including areas where oil lamp use is not seriously disputed by any historian, and simple ventilation, wick trimming, and the use of clean burning oils such as processed castor oil are all well-attested methods ancient Egyptians used specifically to reduce smoke and soot. In other words, the absence of heavy soot in a particular chamber is not, by itself, strong evidence of anything unusual. It may simply reflect careful lamp maintenance, good ventilation, or occasional use of the mirror relay method instead. Still, the underlying question of exactly how much artificial light was available and how it was managed across such a large and complex underground space has never been settled with complete certainty, and that lingering uncertainty is part of why this mystery has never fully gone away. The other pillar of the ancient electricity argument is an object that has nothing directly to do with Dendera at all, but almost always gets mentioned alongside it. In 1938, a German archaeologist named Wilhelm König was cataloging artifacts in a museum collection in Baghdad when he examined a small clay jar, roughly 14 centimeters tall, dated to the Parthian era, which controlled the region around 2,000 years ago. Inside the jar was a copper cylinder, and inside that cylinder sat an iron rod, with the whole assembly sealed at the top with asphalt. König proposed that this object, now known as the Baghdad Battery, could have functioned as a simple galvanic cell if filled with an acidic liquid such as vinegar or grape juice. Decades later, researchers built working replicas and confirmed that the design does produce a small electrical current, typically somewhere around 1 volt, enough to very slowly electroplate a thin layer of one metal onto another, though far too weak to power anything resembling a light source. No wiring, no lamps, and no other electrical components have ever been found alongside these jars or anywhere near them, and most archaeologists today believe they were more likely used for something else entirely, possibly as containers for storing sacred scrolls, given that several similar jars have been found with rolled papyrus material still inside. The battery theory remains unproven, but it did successfully plant a broader question in the public imagination. If some ancient society, somewhere, might have understood a basic electrochemical principle even in passing, how confident can we really be that we understand the full extent of ancient technical knowledge? That single lingering question is precisely the door through which the Dendera light bulb theory has kept walking back into public conversation decade after decade. It is also worth noting that the Baghdad Battery predates the Dendera temple's final construction by roughly 2 centuries and comes from an entirely different region, culture, and language group, hundreds of miles away in Mesopotamia, which means even if the battery theory were eventually proven correct, it would not automatically tell us anything about what the Egyptians themselves understood, believed, or built inside their own temples. The two mysteries are often mentioned together because they both touch on the same emotional question, whether the ancient world was more technologically sophisticated than textbooks generally admit. But historically and geographically, they stand on entirely separate ground, and treating them as though one supports the other is one of the more common shortcuts fringe theories tend to take. Which brings us back to 2025 and to Grok. As large language models became part of daily life for hundreds of millions of people, a new pattern emerged across social media. Instead of researching a topic themselves, users began asking AI chatbots to analyze old mysteries directly, then sharing the responses as though they represented some kind of independent scientific verdict. The Dendera carving became one of the most popular subjects for exactly this kind of exchange, alongside similarly viral prompts asking AI systems to weigh in on the construction of the pyramids or the true face of the Sphinx. When people asked Grok about the Dendera relief, it would typically summarize the same history you have just heard, the Harsomtus and lotus interpretation favored by mainstream Egyptology, alongside the Walter Garn hypothesis and the ongoing fringe theory built on top of it, framed honestly as an unproven fringe interpretation rather than an established fact. But screenshots taken out of that fuller context, focusing only on the vivid technical language Grok used to describe the visual similarities, spread far more widely than the careful caveats surrounding them ever did. Some accounts went further, claiming Grok had performed a precise geometric comparison between the carving's proportions and the design of a real vacuum tube, and had found the measurements matching to within a few percentage points. No published dataset, academic paper, engineering report, or verifiable methodology behind any such claim has ever surfaced, despite the story circulating for months. It appears to function less like a genuine scientific finding and more like a piece of confident-sounding internet folklore, the same way earlier decades produced confident-sounding claims about ancient batteries powering entire lighting systems, dressed up this time in the language of artificial intelligence instead of engineering journals. That does not mean there is nothing genuinely interesting happening at the intersection of artificial intelligence and archaeology, because there absolutely is. Real, peer-reviewed research groups have used machine learning models to help reconstruct fragmented cuneiform tablets, to assist in translating badly damaged papyrus texts, and to help virtually unroll and read the charred, unopenable scrolls buried by the eruption of Vesuvius at Herculaneum. work that has genuinely recovered ancient philosophical texts that no human had read in nearly 2,000 years. Photogrammetry, the technique of building precise three-dimensional models from ordinary photographs, has also become a serious tool for studying temple reliefs, like the ones at Dendera, allowing researchers anywhere in the world to examine minute details of carving depth, tool marks, and proportion without ever needing to travel to Egypt or risk damaging the fragile stone. If a rigorous, transparent, properly documented AI-assisted geometric study of the Dendera reliefs is ever actually published, it would be a genuinely valuable contribution to the debate. What circulated in 2025 does not appear to meet that bar, but the underlying question it gestures toward, whether we have fully accounted for everything encoded in these strange, repeated crypt carvings, remains a legitimate and still unresolved one. There is also a wider pattern worth naming here, because Dendera was not the only ancient mystery to receive this exact treatment. Around the same period, similar viral posts claim that AI chatbots had independently uncovered secret truths about who really built the Great Pyramid, or had reconstructed the original undamaged face of the Great Sphinx from scattered historical descriptions. In each case, the same basic pattern repeats itself almost exactly. A user asks a leading, suggestively phrased question. The model responds with fluent, confident-sounding language that mirrors the structure of a genuine analysis, and screenshots of only the most dramatic sentences circulate far beyond the original conversation, stripped of any surrounding nuance or caveats the model may have actually included. Large language models are, by design, extremely good at sounding authoritative regardless of how well established the underlying claim actually is, and that fluency is precisely what makes them so easy to mistake for verified fact, once a screenshot starts traveling on its own, disconnected from the model, the prompt, and the context that produced it in the first place. So where does that leave the actual mystery, stripped of the viral screenshots and the exaggerated claims attached to them? The religious explanation remains, by a wide margin, the interpretation best supported by the broader context of Egyptian art, mythology, and language. The hieroglyphic text accompanying the carving has been translated by Egyptologists as referring to something like the Great One who gives light, language that fits comfortably within existing hymns describing the sun god Ra as the source of all light and life, and nearly identical phrasing appears elsewhere in Egyptian religious writing with no plausible technological reading at all. The repeated appearance of the scene, 5 or 6 times across the crypts, with only minor variation in the snake's position, is far more consistent with the devotional icon meant to be viewed and understood by initiated priests than with a technical schematic, since religious art across nearly every ancient culture on Earth tends to repeat its most sacred images again and again in slightly varied form. And no electrical wiring, no power source, no comparable object of any kind has ever been discovered anywhere else at Dendera or at any other Egyptian site that would support the idea of a functioning ancient lighting system. And yet the visual resemblance that first stopped Walter Garn in his tracks back in 1966 has never fully gone away either, and it is worth being honest about that instead of dismissing it outright. Human beings are pattern-recognizing creatures by nature, and there is nothing irrational about noticing that an ancient religious symbol happens to share a striking outline with a piece of 19th century technology invented thousands of years later. Coincidental visual resemblance is common throughout the history of art and design, since the physical constraints of certain shapes, an elongated oval container, a curved line suspended inside it, a supporting base beneath, will tend to recur across unrelated cultures and unrelated purposes simply because they are useful, balanced, and visually pleasing forms to carve or build. The real danger is not in noticing the resemblance, it is in mistaking that resemblance for proof. The same mistake amplified 1,000-fold every time a chatbot's confident-sounding paragraph gets stripped of context and turned into a viral claim overnight. There is a further irony sitting at the center of this entire story that rarely gets mentioned. The priest who carved this scene almost certainly intended it to communicate something urgent and important, just not the thing that modern viewers assume. To them, the birth of Harsomtus from the lotus was not a quiet decorative flourish. It represented the daily miracle at the heart of their entire cosmology, the renewal of light and life out of primordial darkness, repeated every single sunrise, a concept significant enough that it was worth hiding in a restricted chamber and entrusting only to initiated priests rather than displaying openly for casual visitors. In that sense, the ancient Egyptians and the modern audience captivated by this carving actually agree on one thing without realizing it. Both groups looked at this image and immediately understood it was describing the arrival of light out of darkness. They simply disagreed, across a gap of 2,000 years, on whether that light was cosmic and symbolic or electrical and literal. What the Dendera light ultimately reveals may say less about ancient Egypt's hidden knowledge and more about our own era's relationship with the past. For over 2,000 years, this carving sat quietly in a chamber almost no one was ever meant to see, understood clearly by the priests who placed it there, embedded in a belief system about creation, divine energy, and cosmic rebirth that made complete sense within its own world. It took a 20th century engineer's eye, and now a 21st century chatbot's confident paragraph, to project an entirely different meaning onto the same lines of carved stone, filtered through the technology of our own time rather than theirs. Perhaps that says something important about how every generation reads the past, not as it actually was, but as a reflection of whatever tools and obsessions define the present moment looking back at it. The carving has not changed in 2,000 years. Only the eyes looking at it have. For now, the Dendera light remains exactly what it has been for over 60 years, a genuinely unresolved question sitting at the boundary between religious symbolism and technological pattern recognition, kept alive as much by the power of a striking image as by any hard evidence on either side. No verified electrical device has ever been found inside the temple, nor anywhere else in Egypt from this period. No confirmed AI-powered geometric analysis has ever actually been published, peer-reviewed, or made available for other researchers to independently check and repeat. Every fresh wave of attention this carving receives, whether sparked by an engineer's photograph in 1966, a best-selling paperback in 1968, or a viral screenshot in 2025, tends to follow the exact same arc: a burst of dramatic claims, a slower and far less viral wave of careful correction from historians, and then a quiet return to the same unresolved starting point, waiting for the next spark to set it off all over again. What remains is an ancient carving, a real and enduring debate among historians and engineers stretching back to 1966, and a fresh wave of internet speculation eager to attach the credibility of artificial intelligence to a question that ultimately still depends on careful archaeology, honest translation, and old-fashioned scholarly patience to ever truly resolve. Until that day comes, if it ever does, the snake will keep floating silently inside its stone lotus deep beneath Dendera, waiting for the next generation to decide, once again, what it thinks it is looking at. What do you think is really carved into that wall deep beneath Dendera? A religious vision of divine light, or something we still do not fully understand? Let us know in the comments below. And if this kind of deep dive into ancient mysteries and the myths that keep growing up around them is something you genuinely enjoy watching, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one.